They called it the hunt of a lifetime. It became a massacre. In the winter of 1895, the most fearless whalers in America sailed into the Bering Sea chasing fortune. What they found was something evolution never intended, a predator that walked on land and ruled the ocean, a fusion of orca and wolf that shouldn't exist but did. Captain Jeremiah Frost thought he'd seen everything the Arctic could unleash. He was wrong. When the first ship stopped answering signals, they found it adrift. Crew vanished, decks soaked in salt and blood, and tracks massive, clawed, dragging, leading from the rail into the frozen hills. Then the attacks began, ships rammed in open water, men snatched from boats. An intelligence behind the slaughter that was terrifyingly aware. The Iñupiat elders had warned them the Akhlut does not forgive trespass. Now, trapped between the ice and something that hunted with the patience of a god, Frost faces an impossible truth. You cannot kill a myth. You can only pray it kills you quickly. But the Akhlut doesn't kill for food, it kills to teach. And the lesson has just begun. The Bering Sea in 1895 was not a wilderness, it was a battlefield. The waters between Alaska and Siberia had become the focal point of industrial extraction on a scale that reshaped entire ecosystems. American whaling fleets, operating from ports in San Francisco and New Bedford, had transformed the Arctic into a theater of economic warfare. The bowhead whale, prized for its baleen and oil, was being systematically harvested to near extinction. This was not exploration, this was conquest by capital. The whaling stations dotted along the Alaskan coast were militarized outposts of commerce. Each vessel represented a significant investment, crewed by men who understood that survival in these waters required discipline equal to any infantry regiment. The maritime doctrine of the era demanded precise navigation, coordinated hunting formations, and an understanding of ice dynamics that would challenge modern glaciologists. The geopolitical canvas was complex. Russian interests remained entrenched despite the 1867 Alaska Purchase. Indigenous Iñupiat and Yupik communities watched as their subsistence economy was industrialized by foreign powers. The whaling fleets operated in a legal gray zone, where international maritime law met traditional hunting grounds, and where the United States government maintained only nominal oversight. Into this volatile environment came reports that defied rational categorization. Between March and October of 1895, 7 separate whaling vessels reported encounters with what their crews described as an amalgamation part orca, part wolf, utterly impossible. The accounts shared disturbing consistency. A creature of massive scale, exhibiting both aquatic and terrestrial locomotion, demonstrating predatory intelligence that exceeded known cetacean behavior. The captains who filed these reports were not superstitious novices. These were veteran mariners, men whose professional reputations depended on accurate observation and measured judgment. The creature bore the name the Iñupiat had given it centuries before, Akhlut. The folklore was ancient, woven into the cosmology of Arctic peoples with the same permanence as the ice itself. The Akhlut was described as a shape-shifter, an orca that could transform into a wolf to hunt on land, leaving tracks that mixed paw prints with the drag marks of a tail. It was not merely a predator. It was a boundary violation, an entity that refused the categories upon which human understanding of the natural world depended. The Western mind in 1895 had no framework for such reports. The scientific establishment, still consolidating Darwinian principles, operated within rigid taxonomic boundaries. Marine mammals were marine. Terrestrial predators were terrestrial. The notion of a hybrid violated fundamental biological architecture. Yet the reports persisted, filed in ship's logs with the same meticulous detail as latitude readings and ice conditions. The strategic implications were immediate. Whaling operations depended on predictability. Crews needed to understand the behavioral patterns of their quarry, the seasonal migrations, the feeding zones. An apex predator that operated outside established ecological parameters represented an unacceptable variable. Several captains altered their hunting routes. Insurance underwriters in San Francisco began asking uncomfortable questions about vessel losses attributed to unusual marine hazards. The military dimension was equally significant. The United States Revenue Cutter Service, the precursor to the Coast Guard, maintained a modest presence in Alaskan waters. Their mandate included search and rescue, enforcement of maritime regulations, and the protection of American commercial interests. Officers aboard the revenue cutters began collecting testimony from whaling crews, compiling a dossier that read like tactical intelligence from an unconventional warfare scenario. The documents described attack patterns. The creature demonstrated flanking behavior, approaching vessels from the lee side where visibility was compromised. It exhibited coordinated hunting, working in tandem with natural orcapods to isolate prey. Most disturbing were accounts of terrestrial incursions. Shore parties reported tracks along isolated beaches, configurations that suggested quadrupedal movement by an animal of enormous mass, accompanied by the distinctive imprint of a cetacean fluke dragged across sand and gravel. The Iñupiat response was measured and ancient. Tribal elders recognized the reports as confirmation of what their oral histories had always maintained. The Akhlut was not myth. It was ecology. A predator that occupied a niche Western science had not yet acknowledged existed. Their response was rooted in generations of adaptive strategy: avoid certain coastal areas during specific lunar cycles, never hunt alone in waters where the creature had been sighted, maintain vigilance when the pack ice broke in unpredictable patterns. The whaling companies faced a crisis of credibility. Acknowledging the reports meant admitting that their operations were subject to threats outside the conventional risk matrix. Dismissing them meant ignoring the judgment of experienced captains and potentially endangering future expeditions. The industry response was characteristic: suppress the narrative, reclassify incidents as navigational errors or equipment failures, and maintain operational tempo. But the men who worked the decks knew otherwise. In the forecastles of whaling ships, the accounts circulated with the weight of battlefield dispatches. Sailors compared sightings, debated the creature's capabilities, and developed informal doctrines for survival. The culture of the whaling fleet absorbed the Akhlut into its operational consciousness, even as official records remained sanitized. The year 1895 represented a convergence. Industrial whaling had reached its operational zenith in the Arctic. Simultaneously, the ecological disruption caused by decades of overhunting had destabilized marine food chains. Indigenous knowledge systems, marginalized but resilient, observed changes in predator behavior that Western science would take another century to acknowledge. And in the cold waters of the Bering Sea, something ancient had become active. The design of conflict was not between nations or competing fleets. It was between human industrial expansion and ecological forces that refused to be categorized, controlled, or conquered. The Akhlut sightings of 1895 represented the friction point where enlightenment, certainty met the vast unknown of the Arctic frontier. The men who sailed north that year understood, on some instinctive level, that they were operating in a theater where the conventional rules of engagement no longer applied. The ocean had always been hostile, but now it was hostile in ways that violated the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire enterprise was constructed. This was not legend seeping into reality. This was reality revealing that legend had been the more accurate map all along. The taxonomic challenge posed by the Akhlut defied every principle of Victorian natural philosophy. To understand the creature described in the 1895 reports requires a forensic reconstruction of the evidence. This was not mere folklore preservation. This was the systematic collection of observational data from trained mariners operating under extreme environmental conditions. The methodology demands respect, even when the conclusions violate biological orthodoxy. The baseline archetype was the orca, Orcinus orca. The killer whale occupied the apex of Arctic marine food chains, a predator of extraordinary intelligence and social complexity. Adult males reached lengths of 9 meters, masses exceeding 6 metric tons, with cognitive capabilities that rivaled the great apes. Orcas demonstrated cultural transmission of hunting techniques, coordinated pack tactics, and the ability to modify behavior based on prey adaptation. The Akhlut accounts described something larger. Captain Jeremiah Frost of the whaling bark Northern Star filed the most detailed report. His encounter occurred on April 12, 1895. approximately 40 nautical miles northwest of Point Hope. Frost was a 30-year veteran of Arctic whaling, a navigator whose charts were used as reference standards by competing vessels. His credibility was institutional. The creature he described measured an estimated 12 to 14 meters in length, substantially exceeding the maximum recorded orca dimensions. The dorsal fin stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, far beyond the typical male orca's 1.8 meter maximum. But the morphological deviation extended beyond scale. Frost described forelimbs that terminated in structures resembling neither flippers nor fully articulated limbs, but something intermediate. The appendages demonstrated flexibility inconsistent with cetacean anatomy, capable of supporting the creature's weight when it hauled itself onto ice floes. This was not beaching behavior. This was deliberate terrestrial locomotion. The head structure defied categorization. The characteristic orca countershading was present, the dramatic black and white pigmentation that served both as camouflage and pod identification. But the skull architecture incorporated features Frost described as lupine, an elongated muzzle beyond the typical orca rostrum, dentition visible even when the jaw was closed, suggesting a predatory apparatus optimized for tearing rather than grasping. The tactical capabilities were most disturbing. Multiple reports described coordinated ambush behavior. The Akhlut would work in concert with natural orcapods, using the whales as screening forces while it maneuvered into attack position. This suggested not only intelligence but interspecies communication, a cognitive sophistication that exceeded even the most advanced documented cetacean behavior. The creature demonstrated an understanding of human hunting patterns. It targeted vessels that had successfully harvested whales, attacking when crews were occupied with flensing operations and vulnerable to assault. This was not opportunistic predation. This was tactical analysis, the identification of moments when defensive capabilities were degraded and attention was focused elsewhere. The terrestrial dimension added another layer of strategic complexity. Shore parties from the whaling ship Arcturus discovered tracks along a gravel beach on the eastern coast of Little Diomede Island in July 1895. The configuration was documented by the vessel surgeon Dr. Edmund Vance, a man whose scientific training included comparative anatomy. Vance's sketches, preserved in the ship's log, depicted a track pattern unlike any known Arctic predator. The print suggested quadrupedal movement with forequarters bearing substantial weight. The spacing indicated a gait between that of a wolf and a bear, optimized for rough coastal terrain. But between the paw impressions were drag marks, consistent with a cetacean fluke being pulled across the substrate. The track width suggested an animal massing well over a metric ton, moving with the deliberate purpose of a stalking predator rather than an animal struggling with terrestrial locomotion. Vance's analysis, though cautious, acknowledged that the evidence defied conventional biological categorization. He noted similarities to pinniped locomotion seals and sea lions that moved efficiently in both marine and terrestrial environments. But the scale was wrong, the anatomy was wrong, and the behavioral implications suggested an ecological niche that contemporary zoology insisted could not exist. The indigenous knowledge base offered a different framework. Iñupiat hunters had documented Akhlut behavior for generations, encoding the information in oral histories, artistic representations, and hunting protocols. Their understanding was not mystical. It was empirical, derived from centuries of close observation and adaptive response. The creature was seasonal, most active during the spring ice breakup and the fall freeze. This correlated with periods when seal populations were most vulnerable, concentrated at breathing holes and haul-out sites. The Akhlut exploited these concentration points, using both aquatic approach and terrestrial ambush depending on ice conditions and prey accessibility. It was territorial, defending specific coastal zones with the aggression of a pack predator. Hunters learned to recognize the signs orca vocalizations with atypical frequency patterns, the absence of seals in otherwise ideal habitat, and specific ice formations that suggested heavy animal traffic between water and land. Most significantly, the Iñupiat understood the Akhlut as an adaptive response to environmental variability. In years of stable ice and predictable marine conditions, sightings decreased. But during periods of ecological disruption, years of unusual ice patterns, changes in prey migration, or increased human activity, the creature became more active and more aggressive. The weapons and capabilities attributed to the Akhlut formed a formidable tactical package. In water, it possessed the orca's full arsenal, echolocation for navigation and prey detection, burst swimming speeds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour, and the ability to generate coordinated attacks with precision timing. The enlarged body mass suggested even greater kinetic impact capability, a living battering ram capable of damaging wooden vessels or killing large prey through blunt force trauma. On land, the capabilities were more speculative but consistently reported. Multiple accounts described remarkable speed across ice and rough terrain, far exceeding what seal locomotion would suggest for an animal of such mass. The limb structure, while not fully lupine, provided sufficient terrestrial mobility to pursue prey away from the water's edge. The dental configuration combines cetacean and carnivore characteristics. The conical teeth of an orca, optimized for gripping struggling prey, were augmented by what several observers described as more blade-like structures toward the rear of the jaw, suggesting a capacity for processing terrestrial prey that required more sophisticated mastication than whole-swallowing techniques orcas typically employed. The strategic assessment of such a creature was sobering. An apex predator capable of operating in multiple environments possessed inherent advantages in an ecosystem of specialists. It could exploit resource bases unavailable to purely marine or purely terrestrial competitors. It could retreat to an alternative environment when threatened, making it nearly impossible to corner or eliminate. And it could optimize its hunting strategy based on prey vulnerability, selecting the attack vector marine or terrestrial that offered the highest probability of success. For the whaling fleets, this represented a threat matrix without precedent. Their vessels were designed to defend against known hazards, ice damage, storms, occasional polar bear encounters. Nothing in their defensive doctrine anticipated a predator that could assault them in water and potentially pursue survivors onto shore. The order of battle in this unconventional engagement favored the creature utterly. It possessed mobility, tactical flexibility, environmental adaptation, and the element of complete surprise against an opponent who refused to acknowledge its existence. The anatomical impossibility of the Akhlut was, perhaps, its greatest weapon. An enemy that cannot be categorized cannot be effectively countered. The spring of 1895 brought the whaling fleet north on schedule, unaware that the season would redefine the boundary between natural history and nightmare. The first documented encounter occurred on March 23rd, before the main body of the fleet had even reached the primary hunting grounds. The steamwhaler Peregrine, operating independently under Captain Marcus Holloway, was navigating the fractured ice fields 60 miles south of Point Barrow when the crew spotted what they initially classified as a large bull orca feeding on a seal kill. Standard protocol dictated maintaining distance. Orcas were competitors for the same prey base but generally posed no threat to vessels. Holloway maintained course, his attention focused on ice navigation rather than marine wildlife. The attack came from astern, a tactical approach that exploited the vessel's blind spot and the engine noise that masked the creature's approach. The impact struck the Peregrine on the port quarter with sufficient force to knock several crew members off their feet. Holloway's first assumption was ice collision, a constant hazard in these waters. But ice does not circle a vessel and prepare for a second assault. The creature surfaced 30 meters off the beam, and the crew's understanding of the natural world fractured. The scale was wrong. This was not merely a large orca. This was something that dwarfed the largest bulls any of them had encountered. The dorsal fin stood tall as a man, the body length exceeding the Peregrine's longboats. But it was the head that paralyzed rational thought, the elongated muzzle, the visible dentition, the eyes that tracked the vessel with unmistakable predatory assessment. Holloway ordered steam full ahead. The Peregrine was a modern vessel, capable of sustained speeds that could outpace most marine life. But the creature matched their pace effortlessly, maintaining position off the port side, occasionally breaching to reveal the full horror of its mass and the impossible articulation of its forelimbs. The pursuit continued for 40 minutes before the creature broke off, diving deep and leaving no trace. Holloway, badly shaken, made for the nearest anchorage and filed a report that his corporate sponsors would quietly bury. But the crew talked, and in the close-knit community of Arctic whalers, the account spread like contagion. The second encounter escalated the threat profile significantly. On May 7th, the whaling bark Endeavour under Captain William Strauss had successfully taken a bowhead and was engaged in the laborious process of flensing stripping. The blubber and baleen from the carcass lashed alongside the vessel. This operation required the majority of the crew to work on deck or in boats positioned around the whale, processing the catch before decomposition degraded its value. The crew was focused, vulnerable, and surrounded by blood. The Akhlut approached from beneath the whale carcass itself, using the massive body as concealment. The first indication of its presence was the sudden violent displacement of the carcass, nearly capsizing two of the processing boats. Then the creature surfaced in the midst of the work party, an eruption of black and white hide and impossible anatomy that sent men scrambling for safety. One boat crew was not fast enough. The Akhluts had emerged beneath their vessel, flipping the longboat and spilling 5 men into water barely above freezing. The creature did not attack the swimmers. It circled them, corralling them against the Endeavour's hull while the dorsal fin cut a slow, deliberate pattern through the bloody water. Strauss responded with the only weapon available, the harpoon cannon mounted on the bow. The shot was hasty, poorly aimed, and struck the creature in the posterior flank rather than the killing zone near the skull. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The Akhlut dove, blood trailing from the wound, and the men in the water were hauled aboard with desperate speed. The creature returned 20 minutes later, but it did not attack. It maintained position 200 meters distant, surfacing periodically, the harpoon still embedded in its hide. It watched. The crew, badly rattled, could feel the weight of that observation, the tactical assessment being conducted by an intelligence they could not fathom. Strauss abandoned the whale carcass and made for deeper water. The Akhlut followed for 3 hours before finally breaking off, diving with a slowness that suggested not retreat but dismissal, as if the vessel had ceased to be of interest. The recovery teams never found the harpoon. The weapon, bearing the Endeavour's registry marks, would surface in an Iñupiat hunting camp 6 months later, returned by the ocean with no explanation. The terrestrial encounters were fewer but psychologically devastating. In late June, a shore party from the Arctic monarch had been dispatched to a small island to collect fresh water from seasonal streams. The party consisted of 8 men under the command of First Mate Robert Ashford, all armed with rifles as standard procedure against polar bears. The island appeared deserted, the snow and gravel showing only the typical tracks of foxes and seabirds. The water collection proceeded without incident. The return to the beach revealed that circumstances had changed. The tracks were fresh, impossibly fresh. They ran parallel to the men's approach route, maintaining a spacing that suggested stalking behavior. The configuration matched the descriptions emerging from other encounters, quadrupedal, heavy, with the characteristic fluke drag that defied rational explanation. Ashford deployed his men in a defensive formation and they withdrew toward the boats. The creature did not show itself, but its presence was palpable. The men reported hearing vocalizations that were neither fully orca nor fully Volf, a harmonic that resonated in the chest and triggered primal flight response. They reached the boats without contact. But as they rowed for the Arctic monarch, several men swore they saw the creature at the waterline, watching their departure with the patience of a predator that understands the prey will return. The psychological toll accumulated across the fleet. Men who had faced storms, ice, and the constant proximity of death in a hostile environment now questioned the fundamental reliability of their senses. Captains found themselves adjudicating between experienced crew members who insisted on the reality of their encounters and officers who demanded adherence to biological orthodoxy. The companies that owned the vessels faced an impossible dilemma. Acknowledging the threat meant accepting casualties from a source that defied insurance categorization and would make future crew recruitment nearly impossible. Denying it meant operating in willful ignorance of a tactical threat that had demonstrated both the capability and inclination to attack. The Revenue Cutter Service responded with characteristic bureaucratic caution. Lieutenant Commander Edward Bering, commanding the Cutter Bear, was dispatched to investigate. Bering was a decorated officer, a veteran of Arctic operations, and a man whose reports carried weight in Washington. His investigation was thorough and deeply uncomfortable. Bering interviewed dozens of crew members, examined ship's logs, and consulted with Iñupiat hunters. His report, filed in September 1895, made no definitive conclusion about the creature's nature, but confirmed that a predatory marine animal of unusual size and behavioral characteristics was operating in Alaskan waters and posed a credible threat to commercial and military vessels. The report recommended increased caution, modified operational procedures for whaling vessels working in isolation, and further scientific investigation. The recommendations were quietly shelved, and Bering was reassigned to less controversial duties. But the encounters continued. Through the summer and into the fall, reports accumulated. Some were dramatic direct assaults, damaged vessels, close calls that left crews traumatized. Others were subtler, the sense of being observed, the discovery of tracks in impossible locations, the sudden absence of marine mammals from areas that should have been teeming with life. The friction of war in this engagement was not between human forces. It was between human certainty and a reality that refused to conform. Every encounter eroded the confidence of men who had built their professional identities on mastery of the Arctic environment. Every sighting reinforced the uncomfortable truth that the natural world contained complexities that Victorian science could not accommodate. The season ended as it always did, with the advance of pack ice driving the fleet south. But the men who returned to San Francisco and New Bedford carried with them the weight of knowledge that could not be comfortably shared. They had seen the boundaries of the possible redrawn in blood and salt water. The Akhlut had won the engagement not through destruction, but through demonstration. It had proven that human industrial expansion into the Arctic operated on sufferance, that the ocean retained the capacity for surprise, and that apex predation was a title that could still be contested. The men who encountered the Akhlut in 1895 were not easily frightened. These were veterans of an industry that killed for profit in waters that killed without mercy. To understand the psychological impact of the encounters requires understanding the mental architecture of the Arctic whaler. These men operated in an environment where death maintained constant presence. Hypothermia, crushing ice, boiler explosions, falls from rigging, the casualty rates in the whaling fleet exceeded those of contemporary military campaigns. Survival demanded emotional discipline, the ability to compartmentalize fear and maintain operational focus under existential threat. The Akhlut shattered that discipline. Thomas Garrett had served 14 seasons as a harpooner aboard various whaling vessels. His skill was legendary, his nerve unquestioned. He had faced charging bowheads, had been thrown from boats by dying whales, had survived ice that crushed ships like paper. But his encounter with the Akhlut on June 15, 1895, ended his career. Garrett was manning the harpoon position on a longboat pursuing a pod of seals when the creature surfaced directly beneath them. The boat rose on the creature's back, tilted at an impossible angle, and hung there for an eternal moment while Garrett stared directly into an eye the size of a dinner plate. An eye that looked back with unmistakable recognition, with calculation, with something that approached contempt. The creature rolled. The boat capsized. And Garrett found himself in the water within arm's reach of jaws that could have bisected him with casual efficiency. But the attack never came. The Akhlut circled him once, close enough that he could feel the displacement wave from its passage, and then dove. Garrett was recovered, physically unharmed. But he never returned to the boats. Fellow crew members reported that he would wake screaming, that he refused to approach the rail when large marine mammals were sighted, that he had developed a tremor in his hands that made fine work impossible. "It knew," Garrett told the ship's surgeon. "It knew I was helpless and it chose not to kill me." That's worse than if it had attacked. It was making a point. The surgeon, a rational man of science, had no response to offer. The testimony of Dr. Edmund Vance, surgeon aboard the Arcturus, provides the clinical perspective of a trained observer attempting to reconcile empirical evidence with biological impossibility. Vance had examined the tracks on Little Diomede Island with systematic thoroughness. He had measured, sketched, and photographed the evidence. His anatomical training allowed him to analyze the weight distribution, the gait pattern, the structural implications of the limb configuration. Every analysis led to the same conclusion: this should not exist. "I cannot classify what I have documented," Vance wrote in his personal journal. "The evidence suggests a tetrapod of substantial mass capable of semi-aquatic locomotion. The dentition implies carnivorous specialization. The scale indicates an apex predator. But the combination of characteristics violates fundamental principles of adaptive radiation. Marine mammals that return to terrestrial locomotion, the pinnipeds, did so at reduced size and efficiency. This creature demonstrates enhanced capability in both environments. It is as if evolution has run in reverse or followed pathways we have not yet identified." Vance struggled with the implications. To accept the evidence meant acknowledging that the taxonomic frameworks taught in medical school were incomplete, that the natural world retained the capacity for forms that defied categorization. To reject it meant dismissing his own observations and professional judgment. He chose uncomfortable acceptance, but the choice cost him. Vance's attempts to publish his findings were met with polite dismissal by scientific journals. His professional reputation suffered. He died in 1903, his research notes archived and forgotten. The indigenous perspective offered different insights, unburdened by the need to reconcile the creature with Western biological categories. Samuel Kotzebue was an Iñupiat hunter who had worked as a guide and translator for several whaling expeditions. His grandfather had been a shaman, keeper of traditional knowledge that stretched back centuries. Kotzebue occupied a difficult position, translating between worldviews that operated on fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of reality. When the Akhlut encounters escalated, whaling captains began seeking Kotzebue's counsel. His advice was practical and ancient. Respect the creature's territory, do not hunt in waters where it has been recently sighted, never pursue wounded prey into coastal areas where it might claim the kill, and above all, do not assume that the natural world exists for human convenience. "The Akhlut is old," Kotzebue explained to Captain Strauss. "Older than your ships, older than your cities. It hunted these waters when our ancestors first came from across the ice. We learned to live with it. You want to conquer it, to fit it into your books and your charts. This is why it troubles you." "It will not fit," Strauss pressed for tactical information. "How could the creature be avoided? What signs preceded its appearance? How could crews defend themselves?" Kotzebue's response was precise. The creature was most active at the boundary times dawn and dusk, the moments between day and night when the Arctic light took on strange qualities. It favored areas where ice met open water, where terrestrial and marine environments merged. It was drawn to blood, which meant that processing kills attracted its attention, and it was territorial, which meant repeated incursions into the same hunting grounds would eventually provoke confrontation. "Can it be killed?" Strauss asked. "Anything can be killed," Kotzebue replied. "But killing it would be foolish. It is alone, or nearly so. It takes what it needs and no more. You are taking everything, leaving nothing. Which of you is the greater threat?" The question was left unanswered. The crew-level testimony reveals the erosion of morale and cohesion that the encounters produced. Aboard the Northern Star, a petition circulated demanding that Captain Frost alter the vessel's operational area to avoid regions where sightings had been reported. The petition was signed by 37 of the 42 crew members, including the first mate and the chief engineer. This was unprecedented, a near mutinous expression of fear that overcame economic incentive and professional discipline. Frost faced an impossible choice. The regions the crew wanted to avoid were precisely the areas where whale populations remained robust. Avoiding them meant returning with reduced catches, potential financial losses, and damaged reputation. But forcing the crew to operate in areas they perceived as lethally dangerous risked complete breakdown of discipline or worse. Frost compromised. He modified hunting protocols, instituted mandatory watch rotations when processing kills, and agreed to immediately withdraw if the creature was sighted. The modifications were expensive in terms of efficiency, but purchased a fragile operational consensus. Similar scenes played out across the fleet. Experienced whalers, men who had never questioned orders, began refusing assignments that would place them in vulnerable positions. Officers found themselves negotiating with crew members offering extra compensation for hazardous duty, accepting operational limitations that would have been unthinkable in previous seasons. The economic impact was measurable. The 1895 season produced approximately 20% fewer barrels of oil and Bering than the previous year, despite similar numbers of vessels and mostly favorable ice conditions. Some of this reduction was attributable to declining whale populations, but fleet managers privately acknowledged that crew efficiency had degraded significantly. The human cost was harder to quantify. No deaths were directly attributed to the Akhlut in the official records. But several men were invalided out with psychological trauma, careers ended by encounters that left no physical scars. Alcoholism and depression rates among returning crew members spiked noticeably, though correlation is not causation. What is certain is that the men who faced the Akhlut carried the experience for the rest of their lives. In the taverns and boarding houses where whalers gathered, the stories were told and retold, refined through repetition into something approaching oral tradition. The creature became part of the occupational folklore, a shared reference point that marked the difference between those who had sailed the Arctic before, 1895, and those who came after. The human forge in this engagement produced a specific type of veteran men who had confronted not enemy forces, but the fundamental limitations of human knowledge, who had learned that mastery was an illusion and that the ocean retained secrets that would not yield to industrial, discipline, or scientific categorization. They returned to civilization changed, carrying knowledge that civilization was not prepared to accept. The analytical challenge posed by the 1895 Akhlut encounters exceeded the capacity of contemporary scientific and military institutions to process. The evidence base was substantial but problematic. Multiple independent observations from trained personnel, recorded in official logs and corroborated by indigenous knowledge systems. Physical evidence in the form of tracks, recovered harpoons, and damaged vessels. Behavioral patterns consistent across encounters, but no specimen, no photograph. No irrefutable proof that would satisfy the evidentiary standards of academic zoology or military intelligence. The Revenue Cutter Service attempted the first systematic analysis. Lieutenant Commander Bering's investigation compiled testimony from 47 individuals, reviewed 17 ships' logs, and documented 12 distinct encounter events. The pattern analysis revealed tactical sophistication that was difficult to reconcile with known animal behavior. The creature demonstrated learning. Early encounters involved direct approaches and overt aggression. Later encounters showed increased caution, flanking maneuvers, exploitation of environmental concealment. This suggested either individual learning across multiple encounters or social transmission of tactical information within a population, both indicators of advanced cognitive function. The creature exhibited prey selection. It targeted vessels that had recently killed whales, were engaged in processing operations, or were operating in isolation away from the main fleet. This was not random predation. This was threat assessment and opportunistic exploitation of vulnerability. Most significantly, the creature displayed restraint. Multiple encounters involved situations where crew members were completely vulnerable in the water. Isolated, defenseless, lethal attacks were rare. The Akhlut seemed capable of distinguishing between defensive response and unprovoked aggression, a level of behavioral discrimination that exceeded documented predator cognition. The military assessment, conducted quietly by naval intelligence officers attached to the Revenue Cutter Service, focused on threat classification and response doctrine. Their conclusions were sobering and remain partially classified even today. If the reports were accurate and the investigating officers believed they were then American commercial and military operations in Alaskan, waters faced an adversary that possessed several critical advantages. Environmental mastery. The creature operated effectively in conditions that severely degraded human capabilities. Arctic waters and coastal zones represented its optimized terrain, while they represented extreme hazardous environments for naval vessels and shore parties. Mobility asymmetry. The ability to transition between aquatic and terrestrial environments provided tactical flexibility that purely maritime or land-based forces could not match. The creature could not be cornered, could not be isolated, and could retreat to whichever environment offered greater security. Intelligence superiority. The behavioral evidence suggested cognitive capabilities that approached or exceeded military working animals. The creature learned, adapted, and modified tactics based on opponent responses. This placed it in a cognitive category closer to human adversaries than wildlife. Conventional weapons vulnerability. Naval artillery and small arms were designed for surface engagements or land warfare. An adversary that operated in three-dimension surface, subsurface, and terrestrial challenged existing weapons doctrine. Several officers noted that even direct hits with harpoon cannons had failed to incapacitate the creature, suggesting either exceptional physical resilience or non-critical hit placement. The recommended response doctrine reflected these challenges. Direct engagement was discouraged unless absolutely necessary for defensive personnel. Vessels were advised to operate in groups, maintain enhanced watch protocols in known encounter areas, and immediately withdraw from regions where the creature had been recently sighted. Shore parties were to be conducted in force with armed overwatch and predetermined retreat routes. The recommendations were pragmatic but defeatist. The United States military, even in its nascent stages of global power projection, was implicitly acknowledging an inability to secure contested terrain against a single biological entity. The scientific assessment was complicated by institutional rigidity. The biological establishment of the 1890s operated within taxonomic frameworks that had no space for hybrid apex predators. The discovery of new species was exciting. The discovery of new categories was threatening. Several researchers attempted to propose classifications. The conservative approach suggested misidentification, that observers had mistaken an unusually large orca for something more exotic, that terrestrial tracks belonged to separate animals and the correlation was coincidental, that the accounts had been contaminated by indigenous folklore and crew superstition. This explanation satisfied institutional preferences but collapsed under evidentiary weight. Too many independent observations, too much specific detail, too many trained observers reporting identical characteristics. The radical approach suggested either an undiscovered species or, more controversially, a hybrid population resulting from genetic anomalies or evolutionary pathways not yet understood. Dr. Edmund Vance's unpublished work proposed a speculative lineage connecting the Akhlut to ancestral cetaceans that had not fully committed to marine adaptation, retaining sufficient terrestrial capability to exploit coastal ecosystems. The hypothesis was scientifically defensible but professionally suicidal. It implied that evolutionary theory, while fundamentally correct, remained incomplete in its understanding of adaptive radiation and niche exploitation. The scientific community in 1895 was not prepared for such nuance. The result was official silence. No major scientific institution validated the reports. No research expedition was mounted to investigate further. The evidence was archived, the witnesses dismissed, and the subject quietly buried under layers of bureaucratic disinterest. The indigenous communities observing this Western institutional paralysis drew different conclusions. The Akhlut had always been part of their ecological knowledge base. The 1895 encounters simply confirmed, to their satisfaction, that Western science's ignorance did not constitute evidence of absence. Iñupiat oral historians noted increased Akhlut activity correlated with periods of ecological stress. The intensive whaling operations had decimated bowhead populations, disrupted food chains, and altered marine environments that had remained relatively stable for millennia. The creature's increased aggression was interpreted not as random animal behavior but as territorial defense against an invasion that threatened ecosystem stability. This framing repositioned the conflict. From the Western perspective, the Akhlut was an anomaly, a threat to commercial operations. From the indigenous perspective, the whaling fleets were the invasion force. The Akhlut was ecosystem response, and the encounters represented a form of natural resistance to unsustainable exploitation. The economic assessment was conducted by whaling company accountants and insurance underwriters with characteristic precision. The 1895 season had been less profitable than projected. Vessel damages, crew compensation demands, reduced operational efficiency, and early season terminations had eroded margins significantly. The question facing the industry was strategic. Could Arctic whaling remain economically viable in an environment where a persistent, unpredictable threat degraded operational security? The answer, reached through cold actuarial calculation, was measured acceptance of risk. The Arctic whaling industry was already in long-term decline due to reduced whale populations and the emerging petroleum industry as competition with whale oil. The Akhlut represented one additional variable in an equation already trending toward unfavorability. The response was operational adjustment rather than strategic withdrawal. Vessels received minor modifications, reinforced hulls, improved watch positions, enhanced small arms inventories. Crew recruitment emphasized experience and psychological resilience. Insurance premiums increased to account for unusual marine hazards. But no fundamental change in operations occurred. The industry had calculated that the profit potential, even degraded, exceeded the risk cost. The Akhlut would be accepted as an environmental hazard, like storms and ice, to be managed rather than eliminated. The assessment, viewed from the perspective of over a century later, reveals the fundamental failure of institutional systems to process information that violated established paradigms. The military could not develop doctrine against an enemy that should not exist. Science could not classify an organism that defied biological categories. Commerce could not efficiently price risk that remained unmeasurable. The Akhlut had won not through military victory, but through categorical disruption. It had revealed the brittleness of human certainty, the narrow boundaries within which industrial civilization operated comfortably, and the vast territories beyond those boundaries where other rules applied. The creature itself remained unclassified, uncatalogued, and unchallenged in its domain. The 1895 encounters faded from official history with disturbing efficiency, but their impact rippled through multiple domains in ways both subtle and profound. The immediate aftermath saw a systematic suppression of the accounts. Whaling companies, facing potential liability and reputation damage, quietly encouraged captains to minimize references to the encounters in official logs. The Revenue Cutter Service, unable to develop actionable doctrine, reclassified the reports as unverified marine phenomena and transferred them to inactive archives. By 1900, the Akhlut had been effectively erased from the institutional record. But the men who had been there maintained their testimony. In the insular community of Arctic mariners, the stories persisted, transmitted through oral culture with the detailed precision of tactical debriefings. The psychological legacy shaped an entire generation of whalers. Men who worked the Arctic after 1895 operated with a fundamentally different relationship to the environment. The confident assumption that human industrial capability could master the ocean was replaced by a more cautious, respectful approach. Hunting practices became more conservative, vessels maintained closer mutual support, and the margins of safety expanded. This shift in operational culture contributed to the whaling industry's declining efficiency, but it also reduced casualty rates. The Akhlut, whether present or not, had imposed a discipline that bureaucratic safety regulations could never achieve. Fear, properly calibrated, was proving to be an effective risk management tool. The scientific legacy was more contested. Dr. Vance's suppressed research represented a road not taken, an approach to biological classification that acknowledged complexity and ambiguity rather than demanding rigid categorical certainty. His work remained unpublished until the 1960s, when shifting paradigms in ecology and evolutionary biology created space for more nuanced analysis. Modern cryptozoologists and fringe researchers have claimed the Akhlut as validation of their methodologies, pointing to the 1895 encounters as proof that science prematurely dismisses eyewitness accounts. This association has, ironically, further marginalized the historical record. Serious researchers avoid topics contaminated by pseudoscientific attention, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of dismissal, yet legitimate scientific questions remain. The Arctic ecosystem is proving far more complex and dynamic than 19th century naturalists understood. The discovery of hybrid populations, growler bears, coy wolves, narwhal beluga hybrids demonstrates that nature exploits genetic boundaries with greater flexibility than classical taxonomy assumed. The possibility that isolated populations of hybrid or transitional marine mammals exist in underobserved Arctic regions cannot be definitively excluded. The indigenous communities maintained their relationship with Akhlut traditions without requiring Western validation. The 1895 encounters confirmed what oral histories had always stated. The boundary between categories is more permeable than industrial civilization acknowledges. And respect for ecological complexity is not superstition but survival strategy. Iñupiat hunters continue to report occasional sightings that match Akhlut descriptions, though with decreasing frequency as climate change reshapes Arctic ecosystems. Whether these represent actual encounters, cultural continuity of interpretation, or misidentification of known species remains unresolved. But the tactical knowledge avoids certain coastal zones during specific seasons, respect territorial markers in ice formations, withdraw from areas where predator behavior seems anomalous persists in contemporary hunting practice. The military legacy is perhaps most significant and least acknowledged. The 1895 encounters represented an early confrontation with asymmetric threats, adversaries that do not conform to conventional force structures, that exploit environmental advantages, and that render traditional military capabilities ineffective. The doctrinal responses developed in reaction to the Akhlut-enhanced reconnaissance. Operational dispersion, avoidance of predictable patterns, acceptance of contested zones would later be recognized as essential components of modern irregular warfare doctrine. The revenue cutter service officers who studied the encounters were, unknowingly, developing frameworks that would prove relevant in contexts far removed from Arctic whaling. The strategic lesson that technological superiority does not guarantee tactical dominance in all environments remains uncomfortable for military establishments accustomed to conventional superiority. The Akhlut demonstrated that a single well-adapted adversary, operating in optimized terrain with superior environmental knowledge, could effectively contest control against numerically and technologically superior forces. The cultural legacy manifests in persistent folklore and artistic representation. The Akhlut has become a fixture of cryptozoological literature, adventure fiction, and contemporary indigenous art. These representations often distort the historical encounters, adding melodramatic elements that the original accounts lacked. But they preserve, however imperfectly, the fundamental narrative. The ocean contains mysteries that industrial civilization has not fully mapped. The ecological legacy is the most speculative but potentially the most significant. If the 1895 encounters represented genuine observations of an undiscovered or hybrid species, then the failure to document and study that species represents a lost opportunity to understand Arctic ecology at a crucial historical moment. The intensive whaling operations that peaked in the 1890s fundamentally altered marine ecosystems throughout the Arctic. Bowhead populations collapsed, orca feeding patterns shifted, seal populations fluctuated wildly. The baseline against which modern marine biologists measure change is itself a degraded ecosystem, the product of industrial extraction on a scale that ecosystem could not sustain. If the Akhlut existed, if it represented an apex predator occupying a unique ecological niche, then its apparent disappearance, or extreme rarity by the early 20th century, represents an extinction or population collapse that occurred without scientific documentation. We do not know what we lost, cannot measure the ecosystem impact, and have no baseline from which to assess recovery. Climate change is now reshaping the Arctic on a scale that dwarfs 19th century whaling impacts. Ice patterns that remained stable for millennia are breaking down. Species ranges are shifting. Entirely new ecosystem configurations are emerging. In this context of radical environmental transformation, the question of the Akhlut becomes less about what existed in 1895 and more about what might emerge in the transformed ecosystems of the 21st century. The enduring question is epistemological. How do we process observations that violate established categories? What evidentiary standards should apply to encounters with the genuinely novel? How do we distinguish between misidentification, cultural interpretation, and actual biological phenomena that science has not yet cataloged? The 1895 Akhlut encounters offer no definitive answers. The evidence was substantial but fell short of scientific proof. The witnesses were credible but operated in extreme conditions where perception could be compromised. The indigenous knowledge was detailed but existed outside Western empirical frameworks. What remains is a historical case study in the collision between human certainty and natural complexity. The whalers who swore they encountered the Akhlut were not lying. The scientists who dismissed the accounts were not engaging in deliberate suppression. The indigenous communities who maintained the traditions were not preserving mere superstition. Each group operated within different evidentiary frameworks, applied different standards of proof, and reached different conclusions about the same events. The Akhlut, whether biological entity or cultural construct, successfully defended its categorical ambiguity. It refused to be captured, classified, or definitively proven or disproven. In doing so, it preserved a space for mystery in an era increasingly committed to comprehensive explanation. The men who encountered the creature in 1895 returned to port with more questions than answers. They had sailed north as hunters, confident in their mastery of industrial technique and comfortable in their understanding of the natural order. They returned as witnesses to complexity, carrying testimony that would never be fully believed but could never be entirely dismissed. The Arctic Ocean accepted their tribute of confusion and doubt, and offered nothing in return but the knowledge that certainty is a luxury the frontier has never afforded. The Akhlut, whatever it was, remains undefeated because it was never truly engaged. It exists now in that liminal space between verification and dismissal, between knowledge and legend, between the documented past and the unknowable depths. And in the cold waters north of Alaska, in places where ice meets open ocean and the boundary between elements blurs, perhaps, something still swims and hunts and watches, indifferent to human need for categorical clarity, ancient and adaptive and utterly unbowed. You have witnessed an analysis that refuses to surrender complexity to convenience, that honors the rigor of the battlefield and the precision of the archive. This is the War Atelier methodology. Surgical in detail, grand in scope, uncompromising in intellectual honesty. If this exploration of the 1895 Akhlut encounters the tactical breakdown, the institutional failure, the enduring mystery resonates with you, then you understand what War Atelier offers. We do not simplify. We do not sensationalize. We examine conflict, strategy, and the human condition under extreme pressure with the same care a master craftsman applies to their work. Subscribe to War Atelier. Join a community that demands more from historical analysis, that values depth over clickbait, and that understands that the most compelling narratives are those grounded in rigorous research and elegant presentation. Every conflict is a canvas. Every strategy is a brushstroke. Every outcome reshapes the art of human endeavor. War Atelier, where history is mastery,